The difference in skin tone did not occur to little Hank when he held his baby sister for the first time. It was an odd scar on her arm that caught his eye. When he examined it more closely, he discovered something unexpected. Jason and Emma had struggled for 10 years to become parents. With several failed attempts at conception, they eventually looked into adoption. They were considered perfect prospects by the agency. And they welcomed Hank into their lives when he showed up with his shiny blue eyes and Jason's type of curly hair. The family prospered over the years. And only those closest to them acknowledged Hank as their adopted son. Life was good until Hank started to miss having a brother. Jason and Emma were struggling to process his request when they received a lucky call from the adoption agency that changed their course. A pregnant young woman who was hoping to place her child for adoption came to light. Jason and Emma seized the chance without much thought, feeling as though destiny had taken over. Hank's unbridled enthusiasm confirmed their choice. No matter what the situation or the gender of the baby, they were ready to grow their family. Anticipation was in the air when they waited for the social worker to arrive the following morning. Jason and Emma were excited, but they were also apprehensive because they knew how complicated the adoption process could be. They were excited to go from a family of 3 to a family of 4. And they were ready for whatever obstacles that could come along. The pair listened carefully as Sharon Anderson went into detail. The birth mother, who was still enrolled in school, had hidden her pregnancy from her disapproving parents. The social worker disclosed. She was forced out of her home because she refused to back down from her decision to place her baby for adoption in the face of pressure from her family. Despite the upsetting circumstances, Jason and Emma were appreciative of the opportunity to grow their family. Still, there were issues to be resolved. The biological mother demanded to be cut off from the child and not to communicate with him or her again. Jason and Emma were willing to make the sacrifice of agreeing to these strict terms. The surprising news that the baby girl will be of a different race then emerged. Jason and Emma remained unwavering in their resolve to move through with the adoption. In spite of the initial shock, their dedication to welcoming their new daughter did not falter. The baby was due in 3 weeks. So plans started moving quickly. Knowing that little Hank might find it difficult to adjust to having a new sibling, the couple thoughtfully prepared him for the impending transition. Remarkably, Hank was ecstatic to hear the news, which confirmed Jason and Emma's faith in the power of their expanding family. They made sure he was prepared to embrace his new sister by telling him about her heritage. It didn't appear to concern Hank in the slightest that his new sibling was not white. He was excited to help her set up her room and was even ready to give up some of his favorite toys to help her feel comfortable. Jason and Emma were waiting anxiously for the news that the young woman was in labor when they received it. Immediately following the newborn girl's birth, the family's joy intensified. Emma remained at the hospital to make sure everything was in order. So it was a happy and bittersweet moment when Joy was placed in her arms. They were overcome with emotion, surrounded by Jason and Hank, when they realized their baby girl was starting a new adventure with her adoptive family, reluctantly saying goodbye for the night after sharing so many special moments. Jason and Hank agreed to meet again for visiting hours the following day. Emma's heart was full with satisfaction when she fell into a deep sleep, even though she was tired from taking care of a newborn. During visiting hours the next morning, Hank excitedly held baby Joy in his arms. His gentle attention amazed Emma, who observed that he was at peace with his new sibling despite her race. Joy started fussing, and Hank instantly calmed her down with his soft rocking. He called out to Jason, expecting to find something shocking. As he started to unzip the blanket and saw something surprising on her arm, looking more closely, Hank saw that under Joy's arm cloth, under a tiny gadget that looked like a microchip. Emma and Jason exchanged anxious looks when they appeared to be scared about something dark. When Sharon Anderson arrived, she was met with the unsettling news when they discussed their next course of action. Emma and Hank stayed with the infant when Sharon was informed of the circumstances. And Sharon asked Jason to help her go over the security tape from the hospital. After listening to the tapes, they discovered that the night before, a black woman had been at Emma's door, chatting with a nurse before going inside. The woman's movements were strangely covert, she never looked at the camera. After recognizing the nurse on camera, Sharon called the police. Realizing that a comprehensive investigation was required, with a mission to reveal the truth about the enigmatic item, they intended to confront the nurse on her upcoming shift. Jason was given the responsibility of making sure Emma and Joy were secure on their way home after being released from the hospital, being alert for any possible threats. The family went to bed after receiving assurances from the police that they would offer updates. But they were unable to sleep due to the uncertainty. Emma's momentary calm was shattered as morning dawned by Jason's ringing phone, heralding the beginning of yet another day clouded by unsolved questions and persistent fear. The policeman's admission seemed like a plot twist from a thriller. "You won't believe what happened," he said, narrating the startling change in course. Confronted with the damning video, the nurse admitted to everything. She acknowledged that she had worn a band-aid to hide the tracking device on Joy's arm. The officer went on, exposing the nurse's cooperation with Joy's biological grandma, which made Jason and Emma shudder, desperate to see her grandson. The grandmother had hired the nurse to implant the monitoring device with the intention of keeping an eye on the family and potentially even taking the baby away in the future. Hank's perceptive eyes were what thwarted their schemes. The family might have unintentionally stepped into the grandmother's trap if it weren't for his astute insight. Jason and Emma understood the grandmother's need, but they also knew that they had to do everything in their power to keep their daughter safe. They were relieved to be able to keep their privacy and ensure the safety of their family. And they were grateful that the scam had been discovered. That's all about the first story, and now let's watch another similar story. After years of adversity, Jimmy was left fatherless and had to take on the difficult responsibility of raising his 3 black triplets by himself. His world was rocked when he realized the babies weren't even his own. He stood over the crib, tears running down his cheeks, mentally reliving Shireen's words, and felt trapped by her tight hold. Her disappearance left behind broken dreams of her giving the triplets the maternal love they deserved. Though unprepared for parenthood, Jimmy was eager to take on the role and had assumed Shireen would be equally committed. But when he tried her number again and got silence, he became aware of how naive he was. Jimmy had pledged unflinching support when they first learned about Shireen's pregnancy, fearing her desire to terminate it. He even set up her meeting with a doctor. When the startling news of triplets turned her confused feelings into a mixture of exhilaration and fear, Jimmy hoped that Shireen would come to feel some responsibility after her first hostility to the idea. He thought back to the colorful woman he had fallen in love with, her contagious energy luring him in despite the red flags he had chosen to ignore. Shireen's need for attention frequently got in the way of their commitment, but she seemed to soften and embrace being a mother during her pregnancy, a spark of hope among the uncertainty of their future. They even talked about marriage. Jimmy brought up the topic of meeting her parents, and Shireen skillfully diverted the discussion. She considered her family to be poisonous and filled with strife, and that chapter had been closed long ago. She claimed that if she wanted to marry Jimmy, it was entirely up to her. Jimmy felt obligated to present Shireen to his mother because they had a strong relationship. But what was telling was his mother's response. She was obviously upset by Shireen. Even though she was trying to be polite, she expressed her worries openly, characterizing Shireen as conceited, devoid of selfless love, and noticeably immature. The couple's dynamic were drastically changed when they learned Shireen was pregnant shortly after this disclosure. Jimmy's mother made it very evident that he had to take on the role of a responsible parent. Knowing he would have to be the fulcrum of their family, Jimmy accepted his new position as a dependable man, prepared to take on the responsibility of rearing their triplets. Hope was aglow on the morning Angie, Becky, and Carly entered the world. Jimmy could see Shireen was tired, but he also saw a resiliency that made him feel quite fond of her. Seeing the 3 daughters, he had a deep affection that eclipsed his previous turmoil. Jimmy saw the arrival of their triplets as a chance to start over, eager to put their turbulent past behind them. However, the reality of having 3 newborns proved to be overwhelming. They were sleep-deprived and easily agitated, finding it difficult to cope. Jimmy's mother was unable to provide full-time assistance, but she did her best to help when she could. They managed the difficulties with Jimmy going back to work by hiring a part-time helper to help with housework and trying to maintain some sort of routine in the middle of the mayhem. Shireen was clearly having trouble balancing her responsibilities as a mother and a housewife. But she was trying her hardest, and things appeared to be getting better between the two of them. Jimmy made the same old proposal to Shireen despite the obstacles. They opted for a small ceremony with Jimmy's family and close friends, postponing the wedding until the babies were 3 months old. But budgetary limitations turned into a bone of contention, igniting furious debates. Shireen wanted more help and time to hang out with friends, but Jimmy suggested she grow up and put her new motherhood obligations first. One day, Jimmy's mother was watching Shireen while she went to the doctor, when she didn't come back for 4 hours. And her phone wasn't on. There was cause for concern. Jimmy took an emergency leave of absence to look for her and set up alternate care for the triplets. But he was unable to find her. Jimmy was even more distressed when he realized he was the only one who could take care of his girls because of suspicions that Shireen might have gone back to an old boyfriend. Jimmy's mother, Grandma Rose, understood her son's difficulties and gave him constant financial and emotional assistance. Jimmy, who was feeling overburdened by his job and his responsibilities as a dad, took comfort in the unanticipated generosity of their neighbor, Mrs. Simpson. Mrs. Simpson, a grandmother herself, offered to help the nanny during the day, which gave their lives a sense of security and comfort. Grandma Rose and Mrs. Simpson developed an odd connection that brought harmony and a feeling of rhythm to their busy home. Jimmy was clearly not in communication with Shireen, and he was happy enough to raise his girls on his own. He was astonished to get a sudden thrill when Alice, Mrs. Simpson's daughter, came to visit. Alice, who was enchanted with the triplets, showed her love for Jimmy as well as the females. Jimmy brought up the subject as their friendship grew, frank in his questioning of whether she was ready to date a father of 3 daughters of race. Though surprised by the question, Alice showed the girls her undying love and care, regardless of their skin tone. Even after their contentious chat, Jimmy felt comforted by Alice's acceptance and was eager to start a new chapter in their relationship. Jimmy sought closure from his past and hired a lawyer to file for divorce from Shireen, who had been absent for nearly 3 years. As a final alternative, the attorney recommended hiring a private investigator. Jimmy started to make progress when Shireen came on their doorstep out of the blue. Her thin physique and worn-out appearance, however, showed that life had taken a toll on her. Jimmy was at a loss for words when Shireen abruptly reappeared and insisted on showing her girls. As Alice was preparing dinner nearby, the triplets were playing merrily on the carpet. Confusion and anxiety were raised by Shireen's presence, particularly when she tried to take custody of the girls and disputed her paternity. Unfamiliar with her, the girls flinched away and sobbed at her touch. and Alice considered walking away. Jimmy begged Alice to stay in spite of the confusion, determined to handle this unanticipated encounter. Jimmy couldn't believe Shireen when she made her shocking accusation, so he confronted her. Grandma Rose's worry matched Jimmy's surprise as hostilities mounted, leading to a crucial moment of truth in the midst of the chaos. Jimmy fervently hoped Shireen's assertion was only the result of her drunken state. But a sick feeling washed over him, casting doubt on his thoughts. Could there possibly be some truth to what she said? Jimmy's once private existence was disrupted by the flurry of medical testing, legal consultations, and nosy visits from social workers during the next few months. When doctors determined he was not the triplets' biological father, it completely rocked his world. This time, Shireen had told the truth. Jimmy felt the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He struggled to accept that he had been cheated out of the opportunity to live a carefree life by taking on the burden of fatherhood under false pretenses. Nevertheless, the idea of leaving the girls he had grown to love as his own broke his heart. Jimmy hadn't been their biological father, but he'd been there for all of their early life significant events. In every way he cared about. They were his daughters. So, even though he had no legal claim to custody, he decided to fight for them. He was doubtful of Shireen's intentions and her abrupt homecoming, doubting that after being away for years, she had regained her mother instincts. Jimmy had to live with the excruciating uncertainty of not knowing how the custody struggle would turn out in court. Jimmy's attorney made a strong case, but Shireen answered with made-up stories of mistreatment, casting Jimmy in a negative light. She claimed to have escaped in order to protect herself and her girls, weaving a tale of terror and desperation. Jimmy felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him in the courtroom. Even with his attorney's best efforts, Shireen's deceit seemed capable of appending everything. Jimmy suddenly had the impression that what he had battled for was vanishing, swept up in a web of falsehoods and dishonesty. Jimmy watched with a sinking heart as the judge seemed to be convinced by Shireen's remarks, even though he had the testimony of Alice and the triplets to back him up. The threat of losing the girls' custody was quite real. But a notable person abruptly showed up in the courtroom and asked to speak. Shireen went from exuberance to anxiety when he got closer to the stand. The man identified himself as Shireen's father, James Carter. In response to the judge's questions, Jimmy steeled himself, ready for incriminating testimony. Still, everyone was taken aback by Mr. Carter's remarks. He recounted his attempts to provide Shireen with responsible guidance, but expressed uncertainty about her capacity to look after the girls. Shireen was willing to help, but she made a snap decision, turning down treatment and putting her career before her family. Mr. Carter emphasized Shireen's desertion and emphasized Jimmy's excellent commitment to the triplets. Enraged by Shireen's dishonesty, the judge decided in Jimmy's favor. Shireen started crying as she realized what she had done and that she would not be able to have custody or visits until she had finished her rehabilitation. A wave of relief swept over Jimmy and Alice when they drove home. When the legal proceedings proceeded, their vision of a unified family was in their sights. They were excited to raise their girls in a loving home with understanding grandparents waiting for them. That's all about this story, and now let's watch another similar story. Officer Miller patrolled the busy streets of Chicago with a sense of dread. I was concerned about his safety. Recent thefts had put her and her squad on high alert, which increased the amount of pressure they were under to perform their duties. Officer Miller's disposition was a reflection of the darkness that pervaded the city on this particular day. When gray clouds were looming above him, an adorable young girl named Lillian, who was just 9 years old at the time, was riding her scooter with much joy when she traversed the quiet road ahead. The scooter, which was a present from her parents on her birthday, served as her means of achieving independence in the midst of the metropolitan environment. Lillian carefully maneuvered her scooter, quickly shifting to the sidewalk when she saw approaching automobiles. She was aware of the importance of exercising caution, which was ingrained in her by her parents. Because she was a black girl living in this neighborhood, she needed to be more than just careful, she needed to be savvy. Being confident, providing responses that are brief, and never providing information that is not essential were the lessons that her parents had instilled in her regarding how to handle encounters with the police. In order to stay out of problems, Lillian was aware of the significance of communicating clearly and working together. However, the unexpected blare of the automobile alarm disturbed the peace as she stretched out to touch a parked car for balance. She had been doing this without any malicious intent. Officer Miller, who was following closely behind, rapidly focused his attention on the disturbance. She was concerned about the potential disruptions that could be produced by Lillian's singing and scooter riding in the neighborhood. So she had been keeping a close eye on her with that suspicion. At a time when Officer Miller was already feeling stressed out from the trials of the day, he mistook the blaring car alarm for a hint that something was wrong. Officer Miller, who was feeling frustrated and irritable, took advantage of the opportunity to impose her authority when she saw Lillian's startled reaction and her quickly retreating from the situation. Officer Miller took prompt action. Despite the fact that Lillian was still a minor in the circumstances surrounding the car alarm, she was motivated by her view of suspicious behavior, immediately activating her sirens and signaling for the girl to halt. She did not even pause to contemplate the fact that Lillian was completely innocent. Lillian mistakenly believed that the halt was intended for someone else at first because she was unaware of the scenario. Lillian did not become aware that she was the intended target until Officer Miller addressed her with strong commands. She attempted to make sense of the circumstances as she was left speechless and bewildered. On the other hand, Lillian's nervousness was only exacerbated by Officer Miller's threatening approach, which triggered anxieties that had been ingrained in her by acquaintances who had told her stories about police targeting young black civilians. Lillian was able to recall the guidance that her parents had given her regarding how to interact with law enforcement. After mustering up her bravery, she responded to Officer Miller's inquiry, making an effort to keep her composure in spite of the booming authority in the officer's voice. The onslaught of questions engulfed Lillian, enveloping her in a chilling and scintillating anxiety that rendered her incapable of restraining the tears that were welling up in her eyes and causing her eyesight to become blurry. It was difficult for her to formulate an answer as Officer Miller continued her rapid-fire interrogation, which was becoming increasingly intense in both tempo and tone. She was stuttering and choking on her cries. The ruckus attracted the attention of the area's residents, who emerged from their homes with their mobile devices in hand to record the unfolding of the scenario. Officer Miller remained steadfast in her duty, unfazed by the gathering crowd's presence. Despite the fact that she couldn't shake a glimmer of vulnerability in the unfamiliar neighborhood without backup. Despite their questioning, she stayed solid in her duty. Although Lillian's tiny frame shook with sobbing as she groped for her handcuffs, Officer Miller remained unaffected by the child's emotions and insisted that the child's refusal to cooperate would result in questioning at the station. She proceeded to cuff Lillian with a snap, and her cries seemed to only serve to feed her wrath rather than alleviate it. At precisely the moment when Officer Miller was going to move forward, an unanticipated intervention took place. Lillian was rescued by Mr. Johnson, a neighbor who was both kind and elderly and who frequently kept an eye on her. When he asserted his position as her godfather, he demanded an explanation for the danger that was hanging over the young girl. Officer Miller made a chilly explanation of her allegations that Lillian was disrupting the peace and acting suspiciously, despite the fact that he had a harsh expression on his face. Mr. Johnson, on the other hand, made an effort to persuade Officer Miller by emphasizing Lillian's virtuous nature and the fact that she was innocent within the community. The fact that she lived practically next door was underlined by him as evidence that she was a well-liked child and not a problem. Even after Mr. Johnson's pleading, Officer Miller did not show any sign of change. Despite the fact that his intervention caused a pause in the situation, Officer Miller was unmoved and persistent in her initial assessment, refusing to reconsider or admit the notion that there was more to the incident than she had noticed. She was adamant about her decision. Despite Mr. Johnson's attempt to intervene, she insisted on taking Lillian to the police station to report the incident. Fear and confusion flooded Lillian as she contemplated the possibility of being brought to the police station. Tears were streaming down her cheeks as she stood there. Fear of disappointing her parents and the prospect of confronting older people who might be dangerous filled her with dread. She was afraid of the prospect of confronting them, despite the fact that she was experiencing an incredible amount of emotions. Lillian was able to collect herself together and beg Officer Miller to at least inform her mother. Nevertheless, her pleadings were ignored by Officer Miller, who continued to concentrate on putting her in handcuffs and was resolute in her determination to follow out her judgment without reservations. Officer Miller put Lillian in handcuffs with resolve, taking her to the back passenger seat of her patrol car before slamming the door shut. Lillian was even more distressed when her scooter fell to the ground in the midst of the pandemonium, its once beautiful pink decorations now scuffed and damaged. Mr. Johnson tried to console Lillian outside the car, telling her to be composed and that everything will work out. Her sobs and tears moved him, and he was struck with immense regret at seeing her in such pain. The uncomfortable state of affairs continued in spite of his attempts to offer consolation and comfort. A beautiful black automobile surprised everyone by pulling up to the scene just as Officer Miller was getting ready to take her place behind the wheel. 7 minutes into the ordeal, an elegantly dressed man emerged, announcing an unprecedented development that was taking place in the midst of the arrest. The reaction of the throng upon the well-dressed man's exit from the car revealed that he was not just any police officer, but rather a well-respected member of the community. When he arrived, the group stayed composed and calm, displaying signals of hope. The man revealed himself as a superior officer and took out his badge, clearly concerned about what was happening. Officer Miller stood up and gave him a formal salute, indicating that he understood his superior status. Officer Miller had no idea that the new officer was Lillian's uncle in addition to being a superior. Strangely enough, he had been following the path and intervened when he spotted Lillian being put into the police car with her scooter on the side of the road. He chose to step in without exposing his relationship with Lillian at the time, wondering what his niece had done to deserve to be detained. Rather, he addressed Officer Miller as Captain Williams and inquired as to the circumstances surrounding the little girl's apprehension. Feeling defensive, Miller stated that Lillian's noisy singing on her scooter had disturbed the neighborhood's calm and raised suspicions of suspicious activity. But Captain Williams interrupted her, denying her assertions and emphasizing the paucity of proof to back up such charges, particularly given that Lillian was only 9 years old. Captain Williams looked at Lillian in the middle of the chaos and anxiety, stroking away her tears and assuring her that she would be okay. He released her handcuffs and heard her side of the tale, acknowledging her perplexity and panic following the wrongful arrest. Lillian broke down in tears as she described how she touched a parked automobile by accident and set off the car alarm, which resulted in her being taken into custody by the threatening policeman. Captain Williams's expression changed upon seeing Lillian's face full of tears and pure terror. His attitude was harsh as he stepped up to Officer Miller, letting her know how disappointed he was with her behavior. He knew of the charges made against her and saw the encounter with Lillian as a sign of those worries. Officer Miller expressed his dissatisfaction with both the way she handled Lillian's detention and what he saw as her racist behavior. It was then that Captain Williams revealed that he was not only Lillian's uncle but also her boss. Lillian's uncle had to deal with her superior's criticism as well as the sobering reality that her actions had deeper consequences. Officer Miller acknowledged the seriousness of the situation while vehemently defending her actions as she struggled with a storm of emotions. With a hint of displeasure in his voice, Captain Williams emphasized the possibility of racial bias in their interactions and the vital importance of de-escalation procedures, especially when dealing with minors. He drew attention to the potentially dire consequences of her actions, which placed doubt on the department's dedication to impartial police. Officer Miller was admonished by Captain Williams to report to the police station, where her supervisors would handle the disciplinary matter. Officer Miller followed the order with obvious pain and humiliation, experiencing the full force of the jeers directed at her. She withdrew to her car and departed, leaving Lillian and her uncle to deal with the fallout from the disturbing event. Captain Williams was affected to see how scared and worried his niece was. He could not stand to see her like this, so he gave her a reassuring hug, consoling and reassuring her despite her horrific ordeal. Realizing that Lillian might have long-lasting scars from the incident, he felt an overwhelming wave of affection and protectiveness as he held her close, tears welling up in his eyes. Captain Williams decided that Officer Miller must answer for her conduct, not just for Lillian's sake but also for the community's safety and well-being. He looked directly into Lillian's eyes and talked softly, telling her that she was not at fault and urging her to keep riding her scooter fearlessly. He found the scooter where it was lying and gave it back to her, promising to fight for justice for everyone. Captain Williams could not watch helplessly when Officer Miller persisted in her unpleasant and intimidating actions, particularly directed at helpless young people like Lillian. Captain Williams gave his niece a farewell embrace and made his way to the police station, determined to finally confront Officer Miller after safely escorting Lillian home and informing her parents of the circumstances. As soon as he arrived, Captain Williams briefed the other police supervisors on Officer Miller's transgressions. He related how his 9-year-old black niece had been harassed by Officer Miller and wrongfully arrested for no other reason than that she was singing and riding her scooter close to her home. Captain Williams emphasized the gravity of the situation, the possible legal repercussions, and the harm to community relations that could result from it. Officer Miller was called in right away after her supervisors, who were shocked by how serious her actions were, called her. Officer Miller was forced to admit her mistake after being presented with the evidence, and she eventually had to bear the repercussions. Officer Miller's supervisors finally removed her badge and put her on probation after realizing how serious her misbehavior had been. Officer Miller felt so bad about what she had done that she felt compelled to apologize to Lillian and her parents as part of her punishment. During her probationary time, she was also required to participate in sensitivity training, which was designed to promote empathy and accountability. It was intended that Officer Miller's community service hours, especially those involving working with children, would make him a more sympathetic and perceptive policeman. For Lillian and her family, the situation's resolution provided some measure of justice and closure. It also taught the police force important lessons about the importance of impartial and fair policing, taking responsibility for one's conduct, and the ongoing need for training and development in order to effectively interact with varied groups. Above is today's story. If you like it, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up.